So my name is Donna Lee. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, in which the Keele Institute for Social Inclusion largely sits. And this event is sponsored by KISI. I'd like to welcome you to Keele and to this grand building and this grand library, to a conversation we're going to have that celebrates the amazing work of Professor Emerita Miriam Bernard. We all have an interest, invested interest in ageing. We all want to age, and we all want that ageing process to be long-lasting and positive. And I'm reminded, as I was walking over here today, I was reminded of something my late father said, and I don't know whether he said it in defiance or seeking out pity, but he once said to me, Donna, ageing is not for wimps. And I think the impact of Mim's work is more of a celebration of how we can generate, celebrate and support ageing as a positive process. So because I've aged myself, I need to put my reading glasses on to just give a very brief celebratory summary of Mim's work. I'm going to call her Mim, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So, Mim is now Professor Emerita of Social Gerontology, but first came to Keele as an undergraduate student exactly 50 years ago, in 1972. Sorry. In 1976, Mim graduated with a combined honours degree in English Literature and Geography, brackets with psychology and geology as subsidiary subjects. After a year working at Wedgwood and then travelling with Steve, her husband-to-be, which I think Steve is here today, so welcome, Steve. She returned to undertake her PhD and was also a resident tutor and sub-warden in Horwood Hall. Mim's career in ageing began in the 1980s at the Beth Johnson Foundation, a local voluntary organisation known for its innovative work with older people. She spent 6 years at the Foundation's research officer before joining Keele's recently established Centre for Social Gerontology in 1988 to help set up and teach on the first postgraduate programme in gerontology in the UK. Building on her education and research background, Mim's gerontological work has been distinguished by a commitment to inter- and multidisciplinary perspectives, and much of her written work combines social scientific research with insights drawn from literature and the arts. She has a long-standing interest in women's lives as they age, and her 40 years of policy and practice-relevant research has included studies of self-health care, of intergenerational relations and family life, of working carers, and of retirement community living, as well as the arts and ageing. Mim has authored and edited 10 books, a dozen monographs, many research reports, and over 100 book chapters and journal articles. Findings from her research have also become plays, exhibitions, newspaper-style publications, and short films. In addition to directing the gerontology courses for many years, Mim was head of the Department of Applied Social Studies, head of the School of Social Relations, and founder-director of the Research Institute for Life Course Studies. In 1999, she was awarded a personal chair. Most recently, in recognition of her significant and lasting contributions to our understanding of ageing and to improving the lives of older people, Mim was the recipient of the prestigious British Society of Gerontology's Outstanding Achievement Award for 2022. So I'm going to hand over now to Professor David Amigomi, who is Director of KISI, who's going to have a conversation with Mim about her fantastic work.
Thank you very much indeed, Donna. Thank you for that introduction. And of course, a very warm welcome to all of you, but especially a warm welcome to Mim. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody when I think we'd want to begin by offering you our congratulations on the award of the Outstanding Achievement Award from BSG. So yeah, we're going to conduct this as a conversation. And having had the really helpful biography from Donna, we can now begin to kind of populate that a bit with some reflections. So just to start off with, how did you come to work with older people? and to define your career in this way?
Well, the very short answer is by accident. The longer answer, and apologies to people in the room that know this or heard me talk about it not so long ago, is that in 1982, I was finishing my PhD. I was registered unemployed because my grant had run out in the autumn of 1981. Steve was teaching locally, and I went into town to go to the Nationwide to get some money out because I needed some money. And I thought, I'll just go over the road and look in the job centre, as they were then, the job centre, pretty much next to the NatWest Bank, for people that know Newcastle-under-Lyme. And in the window of the job centre was a little postcard in the bottom that said, "Wanted, person to lead small research team for local charity." That's all it said. So I went in and asked about it, and they couldn't tell me much other than it was for an organisation called the Beth Johnson Foundation that was in Prince's Road. And they rang up and they got me an interview for the Wednesday, I think it was. I think I was in town on the Monday, so it happened fairly quickly. So I went to the foundation on that Wednesday. I went in through the front door, which you can't do these days, to be met by this cacophony of noise, because the ground floor of Parkfield House in those days was also a day centre for older people, and it was also used by the people who lived in the Beth Johnson Housing Association development called Elizabeth Court next door. So it was full of older people. I found my way upstairs to the office, which I think is still where it is now. And then I got shown into a room for the interview. Now, this job, for those of you who can remember that far back, was a community programme scheme for the long-term unemployed. It was a government scheme, and it was 9 months. It was a 9-month post. So there were 4 people, which I thought was a bit over the top, really, for a 9-month post. There was Arthur Kreber, who's was the director of the foundation, and who couldn't come today, though we're still in contact. There was Vera Ivers, who was the foundation's development officer. There was Gwyn Price, who was a member of the foundation's council. And there was Frank Glendenning, Angela's late husband, who was the chair of the foundation's council. I don't remember a great deal of the interview, needless to say. I do remember talking about the research I was doing, how much I liked doing research. And then Frank asked me why Keele, and asked me about Keele. And I spent quite a long time explaining in words of one syllable what Keele was all about, how it was founded on socialist principles, how it supported and championed a multidisciplinary education, people mixing arts and sciences, how it was a highly residential campus, and I had been on the residential staff. And Frank let me go on until at one point he fixed me with what I later came to realise was a mischievous frank glint in his eye, and said very slowly to me, "I do know about Keele, you know. I'm secretary of the adult education department." And then, very ominously, he said, "And I know who you are." At which point my heart sank and I couldn't get out of there quick enough. And I remember going home and saying to Steve, "That's it, I've completely blown it." But Arthur rang me up later that afternoon and said, "We'd like to offer you the post. Can you start on Monday?" And that night,
a bit of a flavour for
Yeah.
what it's like working in the BJF
well,
at that time.
that was a baptism of fire. I knew nothing about ageing. Often with these things, you look back and you can put the pieces together. So I'd grown up in a 3-generation, quite a big family household with my grandfather and my dad's brother and family and our family. So there were always older people around, actually, looking back. But there were always older people around at the Beth Johnson. And so you couldn't help but interact with people. I mean, it was, that was what we did. You also had to be very flexible. You had to be willing to do all sorts of stuff, although I was technically there as a research officer. I think on about the second day, Arthur took me, or came to get me, in what was, for those of you that know Parkfield House, I was in the attic. I was in the attic office. Don't use it anymore, health and safety. I had a rope ladder that you were meant to throw out of the window if there was a fire and climb down it. Arthur took me to Bentley, where the foundation had and ran a day centre in the middle of the Bentley estate. And I thought he was just taking me to show me all the things that Beth Johnson Foundation did. But within about half an hour of being there, I was asked to judge the Easter bonnet competition. So it was
Diverse.
it was it was an interesting time. We did lots of different kinds of projects. We did research that monitored and evaluated the foundation's own developments. Later we tended for and got commissioned to do other research. So I did work on dementia with projects that were happening in Shropshire and in Mid-Essex. And then we got a big project funded through the European Poverty Programme initially, and then through health education to develop self-health care in old age. So yeah, it was very varied. I worked with research teams, people who were also off the unemployment register. So I had to teach very quickly, because I had to teach people the basics of research. And so it was, I was researching, teaching, doing anything else that the foundation wanted me to do, pretty much.
So in many ways, it was a kind of a perfect preparation for a move back into higher education, because in the 1980s, you came back to Keele to help to establish the Centre for Social Gerontology. So what did that involve? And what did it say about reflecting back, what did it say about the kind of interface between teaching and research? You've already said you've got some experience, you had developing experience of that through the way BJF was organised.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I've said before, I learnt my research craft at the foundation. I learnt by doing. I learnt, the theory is fine. And, in subsequent years, I've taught, all about research methods and so on. But the doing of it, the teaching of it to people who didn't know anything, really, and the involving of older people was really important. So I think I brought that back, in a sense, when I came back to Keele. And working with adults, because the Centre for Social Gerontology had been established the year before, in 1987. Frank and Chris Phillipson had decided that we were going to have a Centre for Social Gerontology here. And I had, by that time, got a lot of contacts in the voluntary sector, in the third sector, with social workers that I've been working with health people that I've been working with. And also academic, because I joined the BSG in 1982. So I've been a member of the BSG for 40 years as well. And so the programmes that they had set up here, I remember, sorry, I'm going to digress. We got sent the proposals for the programmes by Frank and Chris to comment on at the foundation. And I remember scribbling in the margin to Arthur, if this course ever comes off, I think I better go and do it because I haven't got any qualifications in it. So to end up here being the one who was supposed to be teaching on it and recruiting to it and generally holding, the fort here was a bit of a shock. It was a steep learning curve, as they say. They were postgrad programs. They were, people that came were adults. They weren't 21-year-olds fresh off a first degree. And the Centre for Social Gerontology was located in the Department of Adult and Continuing Education, as it was then. So they were demanding students. And because it was postgrad, it was meant to be research-based. And what we were teaching was meant to be underpinned by research, both, in terms of our knowledge of research, but also as active researchers ourselves. And if you went on and did the masters, you had to do a research-based dissertation. We were a very small band at the beginning. Sue and I shared an office. Sue was our administrator, and we worked together for many years subsequently. And there was Chris and there was Frank, and then we would pull in other people, geriatricians to do the medical stuff, people locally that we worked with and knew. And I was on a 3-year temporary self-funded contract initially. Basically, if I hadn't recruited students to the course, I wasn't going to have a job at the end of 3 years. So it was an incentive to work fairly hard and get them established.
I suppose we tend to think of the present day as characterising a degree of precarity in academic contracts, but it's interesting to note that it's in some contexts it's always been there. So
I think it had.
Yeah.
I mean, my contracts at the foundation were all short-term and temporary contracts. So by the time I had sort of got a permanent, in inverted commas, contract, I'd done 10 years of short-term research contracts.
Just to pick up on something that you mentioned, you've mentioned it twice really, in terms of working at BJF, you were obviously around older people all the time, and so you began to learn about involving older people in your work. And I guess you could say that your career is known for the way in which you've always involved what we now describe as research users in the design and the practice of your research. This means working with older people. So how did you come to, actively work with older people in your research? In what ways did you work with older people? What were the kind of methods, techniques, and entry points that you were using?
Well, at the foundation, as I say, there were people, there were older people around, and we worked with them in terms of the foundation's own developments. The foundation had a philosophy that you worked with older people. You didn't do things to older people or research about older people without it being, fed back to at least to them in terms of what your findings were. So it was very much, if you like, a kind of action research or participatory research model and philosophy. So we did it all the time. It was just a natural thing that we did. And when we set up the Self-Health Care in Old Age project, for example, in 1986, we involved older people in terms of, having a cycle of doing stuff with people, getting results, feeding back results, getting people's views on the results that we were feeding back with them in order to, change the practice or amend the practice. So it was an ongoing cycle. I was never taught to do research that way. It was just something we did automatically. And so it was natural, even though it wasn't common in academia, it was a way that we would develop here. And through gerontology generally, I think it has taken on board that. So we had, for all the projects pretty much that we did subsequently, we had user groups, we had advisory groups that involved older people. And I suspect we'll go on to talk about the Ages and Stages project, but when we got to that, it was a requirement. Certain funding bodies subsequently would require you to show how you had developed the work with older people and how you were involving older people. And as you well know, that programme, which was something called the New Dynamics of Ageing national programme, had a group of older people called something like the Older People's Reference Group, snappy title. And that was quite a big group of people, and they could opt to be on whichever project in the national programme they wanted to be, as well as being part of this group that oversaw the whole programme. Most projects had one or two of those older people. We had four. Four opted to come and tell us their views about the Ages and Stages project.
And a very lively four they were.
And a very lively four they were.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so it is about treating people as human beings. They're not being involved because they're older. They're being involved because they're part of the research that we're doing. And one of the subsequent projects that we had to Ages and Stages, under that terrible programme called Cultural Value, we decided, as another example, that we were going to look at the impact that Ages and Stages had had on the people that had been involved for the previous 4 or 5 years. But we wanted the people that were involved to be doing the research themselves. So I think there's some people in the audience will remember we had a day where we were learning research techniques here at Keele, and then they were going out and doing the interviews with other folk as well. So
I mean, it's really
it's been part and parcel of
absolutely.
everything.
And it's interesting to reflect on the fact that, this was something that was natural. So when it was legislated as a kind of requirement,
Yes.
that was fine. You were already in that space. No, that's fascinating. And of course, what you're talking about there is collaboration. It's collaboration
Absolutely.
with older people. It's collaboration with research users and researchers now. Again, to reflect on that difference now between perhaps as the profession was when you came into it and as it is now, researchers now are expected to work collaboratively in teams. Centre for Social Gerontology and gerontological research in general, I guess, perhaps pioneered this way of working. So how did you come to work with other researchers? How did you come to work collaboratively with other researchers? What are the pleasures and advantages of doing that? And, how is this way, what's this way of working given to you as a researcher?
I've always worked in teams, actually. Thinking back, even when I did my PhD, we trained some of our undergraduate students, and some of them helped in the interviewing, actually, for my PhD. It wasn't common when I came back into academia to work collaboratively and collectively. And, you know, we might want to talk more about it, but it was very much, even in social science, the lone scholar model, which is common in humanities, and I guess more so in terms of publication. You know, there was pressure to have single-authored articles, you know, single-authored books. But, you know, my background was an applied background, so it was something that I was used to doing. I preferred working that way. I actually do like working in teams. I like the different perspectives that people bring, because you can get very set in your own way of doing things and your own take on things. So pretty much all the research thinking, all the research projects have been team-based projects. That's not to say that it doesn't need, you know, somebody who is, in the jargon, the principal investigator, or, you know, somebody with whom the buck stops, and somebody who, you know, may have to make certain decisions.
So all teams need leading, really, in that sense, yeah.
Yeah, but in terms of working collectively and collaboratively, that's my background. You know, I was brought up, and I am a feminist. Yeah. You know, that was the way I had been, you know, brought up, and that was how I operated. That was how I worked.
I mean, that's a really interesting a really interesting insight, because, you know, you've said that there's a disciplinary dimension to this, because, you know, I come from a humanities background where the lone scholar model has been very dominant for a long time. But also there is perhaps a gender, you know, mentioning feminism, there's a gender dimension to this as well. I mean, is that something that you experienced in the course of your career and in your experience of collaborating?
I mean, Donna said when she was reading my brief bio that I've always been interested in women's lives as they age. I don't think there was consciously. I think it was a very male-dominated institution back in 1988 when I joined it. When I joined the Department of Adult and Continuing Education, there was one other woman on the staff who, when I joined in March, left at that Easter. I was the only female member of staff, which is why I think Sue and I kind of bonded, because, I mean, you know, all the academic staff were male. It was the same when Steve and I were in the geography department. There was one female biologist, biogeographer. So, in a sense, I kind of naturally gravitated to working with other women where I could, and looking at, you know, what was happening to our lives, and that means that I haven't worked solely with other women, absolutely not. But it was a way of kind of having some solidarity, having some sort of sense of, I'm not completely off beam here, you know, and support. You know, it was about mutual support.
Absolutely. And by that route, I guess, so many women became very skilled leaders of teams, actually, as a result of that kind of experience. Yeah.
And I ended up being the person, if anybody was doing research on women, they would come to me, or, you know, if there was a PhD student doing anything vaguely remotely related to women, even if it wasn't gerontology. I'm smiling at Bernadette. It was me. It ended up being me.
So we're going to think a little bit about, you know, what comes out of this career, and it is academic outputs. which
Partly.
collaboratively produced or individually produced. There are a lot of them, and it's been an amazingly successful career in that sense. I think from Donna's biography, it's 10 books and 100 chapters and papers and so on. Never mind all the other research reports that you produced. So, could you reflect a little bit on the highlights of those outputs? Which are the ones that really stand out for you? And is there perhaps in some cases, ones that have stood out because of the way that you were enabled to work on them?
Oh, absolutely. I've said in other forums that there are a lot of things I'm proud of actually looking back. But in terms of publications, the two books that I'm still most proud of are the books we wrote about older women, or midlife and older women. Back in the late 1980s and 1990s, I had been at the foundation and working with people who worked, a very good friend who worked at Pensioners Link at the time, and other friends that we made that worked with Help the Aged Education Department as it was, Age Concern as it was then. And we were slightly concerned that we couldn't find anything in the literature in the UK about older women. So we decided to see if we could do something about that. But we decided to do it a particular way. So we got a group of women together, Kathy and I, who worked not just in academia, but worked in, as I say, things like Pensioners Link, Age Concern, and so on. And we eventually produced this book called Women Come of Age. And we did it collaboratively and we did it collectively. In 1990, I remember taking our second-born son, who was 2 months old, in a sling on the train down to London to have the first meeting of the group that was going to see if we could write a book. I was met at Euston Station by our publisher, who whisked me off. Our publisher was Edward Arnold at the time. And we met in their offices, and our editor took my 2-month-old Ben off, and then just brought him back when he needed feeding. And so we sort of mapped out how we were going to do this book, how we were going to comment on each other's chapters, how we were going to try and get together at frequent points, and what we wanted for it. And we wanted a number of things for it. Colleague Joanna Bornat, who became the UK's first Professor of Oral History at the Open University, Joanna arranged to interview 5 older women, especially for the book, and it's their pictures on the front. And so their words, she wrote a chapter about it, but their words are in every other chapter. So every other chapter starts with words from these women, and is illustrated with words from those women. We were also concerned that women's writing wasn't as visible as it might be, and this is rather quirky, but where there was a female author that we were referring to, where she's mentioned at least first in a chapter, we put people's full names. We put people's first and second names so that up to a point you can identify female authors in what we were writing. And then we wrote the last chapter collaboratively with a colleague who is Professor Anthea Tinker, who was at King's College, and King's College was the other place that had established gerontology programs. And I was scared stiff of Anthea. She was like a big gerontology person. I'd just started, but she was fantastic. So we did it collaboratively. We did it in those ways, and we had, those things in it. And then a few years later, when I was back at Keele, I think we were, Sue? The Department of Applied Social Studies then, probably. Let's just say it wasn't necessarily the best time. And so one of the things that we did was get the women staff together in the department and women PhD students and talk about something that would bring all of us together. And we did a second book, which I have to say our male colleagues were scathing that we would ever get it done or ever get it published. But this is that other book called Women Ageing, Changing Identities, Challenging Myths. And it's published by Routledge. So it wasn't a two-bit little publish. And we also did this collaboratively. Steve will remember. We were, in our back garden when we lived in Kingsfield Oval, group of us. And although it says edited on the front, there were 4 of us on the front who were 4 colleagues in the department, in social work, in counselling and in gerontology. So we weren't all gerontologists, and our female PhD students.
And it's interesting to mention PhD students because this has always been a really important part of your academic life, of working with the next generation of scholars.
I love working with PhD students. Not something that was shared by certain of my colleagues. Can I also just say, before I say that, though, this is dedicated to Sue. She knows that, because she also helped immensely with that. But yeah, the PhD students, once the master's degree began to generate graduates, and once what we were doing was more widely known, we did start getting people wanting to do PhDs with us. And then in subsequent years, we also applied for and got, funding, both internally and collaborative awards, like has just happened here, with the Beth Johnson Foundation and Alan, who was the director at the time and who's here. So over the years, I think our first PhD student graduated in 1998, and then I've seen through 20-something others since for their PhDs. And for me, there are all, in other circumstances, they would be projects I wanted to be doing myself, and there were a lot of stuff about ageing for women, but there were, lots of other things as well, lots of other subjects. I can look them up if you want, but I do have a complete list. And external examining. So I also got asked often to externally examine other PhDs that were about older women at other places. But it's asking a lot. I mean, a PhD, especially if you're doing it part-time, which a lot of our folk were, is a long haul, and it asks a lot of that relationship. And whilst some of them I did singly, again, doing that collaboratively with other people is also really important. Hard for the student if they've got, 2 people with differing views about what they're doing.
If they're helpfully differing views.
Helpfully differing views. Or in the case of the PhD student that we had attached to the Ages and Stages project, poor Ruth had 3 of us.
She did.
So, PhD work, I think, is hard haul, but I used to love doing it. And some of my students would say, we were all right with Mim. She'll put the apostrophes in your work for you. Don't worry about the apostrophes. She'll correct all of those.
I think my experience of you supervising was that you did a bit more than that, actually. but you mentioned the Ages and Stages project, and that takes us back to 2009.
Yeah.
You did English and geography as part of your first degree, and as Donna's introduction said, you've always had a kind of a love of literary and visual material and so on. So in 2009, you could say that your career had turned full circle with the beginning of that project, and it's great to welcome people from the Ages and Stages project and team and Ages and Stages company back here today. Thank you very much for coming. So did Ages and Stages represent a creative turn in your work, or a return to creativity, given that you have always had that kind of dimension in your life?
It brought together all the things I was interested in, really. It wasn't, I don't think it represented a creative turn, because I had always tried to incorporate some of the literary stuff that I loved. I had always thought visual stuff was important, and sort of personal biography stuff was important. We didn't have much scope at the foundation. We were a charity. We produced things that looked like this. Right? Pretty boring. But, that was what we could afford at the time. And so when I was doing research reports, we would produce A4 ones. So I'd try and get cartoons on the cover or photographs inside, usually black. I mean, they were always black and white in those days. I also I gave my inaugural in 2001, and we didn't have the technical equipment that we have now, but I did show pictures. As well as the sort of text, what I tried to do in that was show my life course, because I knew there were some children in the audience, including my own small children. I thought they needed some distraction. So, the visual was important. And I think, I did a book, I don't know if I've got it here, actually. I did a book with... I did a book with two of my social work colleagues, Mo Ray and Judith Phillips. I worked a lot with Judith while she was here. Social work's not my thing, particularly, but this is a book called Critical Issues in Social Work with Older People. And I suggested, and they went with it, that we used Margaret, if anybody knows or is a fan of Margaret Forster, I used to love Margaret Forster novels. So we used her novel, Have the Men Had Enough, to illustrate the various things we were writing about in this book and to start each chapter. So there is Margaret Forster stuff all the way through this book, for instance. And we were vindicated because we got blooming good reviews for that, and they picked out the fact that we had used literary stuff in it. I also used to sneak it in a lot to the courses, the gerontology courses. We never did stuff that was called the literature of ageing, but I used to make my students read a novel associated with whichever module we were doing. So I don't know, if we were doing a module on residential care, I'd make them read a novel that was, set in residential care, and then we'd have a session at the end. So it's always been there. I think with what we've been able to do since 2009. Has been the icing on the cake as far as I'm concerned, really, because it brought all of that together.
Can you just sum up what it was like to do the Ages and Stages project, because it's got a really long life now, a long and impressive life.
We never imagined. We never imagined in, when was it? 2009 that we started, but we had to start thinking about it 2 years before, 3 years before. David and I were both founder directors of research institutes at Keele, and so we started working together in 2006. And I remember that we sat down at one point and said, it'd be nice to work together at some point. I wonder what there might be that would cut across our interests. And that was probably about 2007. And the first phase of the New Dynamics of Ageing programme was running at that point. And then in 2008, we kind of shelved it, didn't we? We weren't thinking about it too much. The New Dynamics of Ageing announced a second wave of funding, and it called specifically for projects on the biology of ageing and on arts and ageing. And we thought, bingo, here at last is, a funding opportunity that we might be able to respond to. And so we worked together with other colleagues, another colleague in English literature at the time, Lucy Munro, who's at King's, and the Prof of Psychology here, Michael Murray. And we put together a bid. It was a long and tortuous process because it was a huge national programme, and you had to put in an initial bid, and there were 190-odd bids, which they then asked 40-something to write longer proposals for. And we then got down to the last dozen, and we got funded. And we got funded for 3 years. We got a 3-year programme of work that was looking at the documentary productions at the New Vic and through the archive at Staff's University. We'd worked with Peter Cheeseman on the bid. He was, in terms of what we were doing. We wanted to interview older people who had been associated with the theatre in terms of being audience members for all their lives, being volunteers at the theatre, being sources for the original documentaries, they had now grown old, or being people that worked, had come and worked at the theatre and had made their lives in this area. And then we had this, ridiculous ambition that we would put all this material together and we would create an exhibition and we would write a new social documentary that we would bring back, we would get people who we'd interviewed to come back and help us with and put on. So we were fairly ambitious. And we were a big team because there were the 4 of us. We appointed Michelle as our research associate. We had a PhD student linked to it. We had an administrator on it. So there were 7. There were 7 of us. So it was a big programme, and we thought, well, we'll go all out. It's 3 years. In 2012, we didn't know at the time we bid, but 2012 was the 50th anniversary of the theatre. It was also the 50th anniversary of Keele. So we hit the 50th anniversaries of both institutions. And it was wonderful. And we put, Jill wrote the script. We all, kind of worked in terms of workshops. We involved the youth theatre. We put on an exhibition. We took what became called Our Age, Our Stage on tour for 2 weeks before. And we then played to a capacity house in the New Vic because we were running the British Society of Gerontology's annual conference here at Keele because they didn't have enough to do. So we took all the delegates to see the production. And we thought that would be it. We thought, we'll go out with this big... We thought that would be it. Little did we know, 13 years later, we would still be going, because we then got more research monies. I got what's called follow-on funding. We then got money through the AHRC. We've had money through Arts Council England. We've had money through the Baring Foundation. We've had money through lottery. And we now have the Ages and Stages Theatre Company hosted at the Vic. And they do all sorts of wonderful work.
They do indeed. And just as we come to this is going to be the last question. What you generated was an amazingly impactful project. You personally won an ESRC award for impact because of the Ages and Stages work. There's also the Career Achievement Award from BSG. And of course, impact is something that academic researchers really pursue now, and it's necessary. I just wondered if you had any kind of thoughts about impact, just to conclude, your reflections this afternoon.
We didn't call it impact. We didn't call it impact back in the day. It was about making a difference, really. It was about giving back to people. And we weren't taught to do it. I think, there's all sorts of training courses now, aren't there, on how you do impact, pathways to impact, how you achieve impact. I think it's hard to know. Obviously, you can ask people. There are people in the audience probably more equipped to speak to what impact something like Ages and Stages has had on them than me saying, I think it's done X, Y, and Z. I recognise that it's important. I'm not sure you can necessarily teach it to people who are, who don't necessarily.
And I think you were going to reflect a little bit on impact through the visual images.
Well, yeah. You might be wondering why these are up here. The one on the right is me at the age of, 14 months, 16 months, 18 months. I think that has had more impact over my lifetime than probably anything academic I've written. And I say that because my father was a professional photographer. And that was a poster in Athena. For those of you who remember Athena posters, I was a poster girl. I was a poster. I am a small poster. I am a postcard. I am a greetings card. I'm 2 greetings cards. And that has been seen and commented on in all sorts of places. Unexpected impact. A friend saw it in a pub in London, and the barman insisted it was him. even when she pointed out that actually beneath that little coat I am wearing a dress. You might think it was a little boy if you only saw the head. That's a different story. We were doing collaborative work with colleagues at University College Cork. We got a feminist sort of network thing, and Judith, another colleague of ours, Pat, and I went over to Cork. We didn't know those colleagues, we just went over to meet them. We walked into the office, and on the notice board of the person we were going to see was me as a postcard. And then in 2010, we had gone, Alan and me and 2 of our PhD students had gone to Singapore for the International Consortium of Intergenerational Programs Conference. And then I was flying on with the PhD students to Australia to go to the International Federation on Ageing Conference in Melbourne. And then we were having a couple of days at the end to go to Sydney. And my friend and colleague Judith Phillips, who by that time was at Swansea University, wasn't here any longer. We were meeting Judith in Sydney. So we flew into Sydney. She'd gone earlier. I was teaching at the University of Melbourne after the conference. And we got into Sydney, and we got to the hotel. I thought, oh, where's Judith? Anyway, she rang me, and she said, you won't believe this. She said, I'm stood in a shopping mall in a suburb in Sydney. I don't know where she was. She said, I'm stood in front of a shoe shop, and in the window is this great big picture of you. And bear in mind that it was May in Australia, so it's their autumn going into winter. It's our spring into summer. And so there was this picture of me that said, so boots are hot this winter. And underneath says, I hope so. And she sent me the picture at the weekend of it. So I've got the photographic evidence. So it's a salutary reminder to me that, you can think you have all sorts of impacts, but you have unexpected impacts. And one of the other unexpected impacts was the women's book we did here while we were at Keele. I can't read it. But 3 years later, this is the Korean version. We're big in Korea, or we were big in Korea. We don't know what impact we have. The other picture is from the last project I did while I was at Keele, which is the Ageing of British Gerontology project. And that also brought full circle because we were interviewing people that had been key to the establishment of gerontology in this country. And I wanted that we have a photographic record as well. And I wanted that to be decent, professional photographs. And in 2012, when we were here for the conference, there had been a PhD student exhibiting. We had an exhibition called Suki Parnell. And Suki was a professional photographer and doing her PhD on women and ageing and beauty. So when we got the Ageing of British Gerontology project, I asked Suki if she'd like to be involved. And she took fantastic portraits of everybody that we interviewed for that project. And I had the ambition that we would produce it as a coffee table book. That was far too expensive. So it ended up, and it's a digital exhibition that's on the BSG's website, but it's also this. It's a newspaper-style publication. So all the pictures are in here with quotes from people. And then they're also in the book, because we did write a book. They're also all on the cover of the book, and they're all in the middle. And they're in colour, because, of course, we're digital now, and I guess it doesn't cost publishers, what it would used to cost to produce colour images. So, that it's always been important. They're really nice reproductions, I think.
I want to thank you so much for your reflections this afternoon. I think we will all have enjoyed them. One thing that comes through, I think, that whatever you do it organically. You learn the research, as it were, on the job. Yeah. You work with people because that's the opportunity and that's the need, and also impact. It's something that you can plan for in part, but there's a degree of serendipity about it, and that's really important. So thank you so much for those reflections. I think we are at the end of our hour now. I just want to thank Mim very much indeed for her brilliant reflections this afternoon, and thank you all indeed for coming along.
Thank you very much.